You've had a couple of long readings, so I'll make this brief. Many years ago, I sat on the knee, metaphorically speaking, of a bishop. Our parish had gathered to discuss an issue that was contentious and threatening, and our bishop opened the proceedings with some advice on how we might approach the topic before us. In thinking about and discussing this issue, we were urged to draw from the resources that had, traditionally, stood our church in good stead. He went on to describe the merits of a three-legged seat or stool, the legs of which could be seen to represent Scripture, reason, and tradition. And it was by those three legs that the church had maintained itself in steadiness throughout the years and was able to manage its ecclesiastical conundrums and difficulties. We were enjoyed to rely on all three legs in balance. We were encouraged to draw from each of those things that which would assist us in reaching a decision. We all nodded and made sort of noises. And I must say at the time, it all made very good sense. I remember being impressed with the wisdom of this synology, tradition, Scripture, and reason. But I was young then. Well, today we don't have a lot of time to delve into a lot of Scripture. I'm far too canny and unqualified to resort to pure reason. So it's the third leg, tradition. For Mark's reading does seem to focus on tradition. The word is mentioned 6 times in the reading and alluded to often. Now, I like to think that in many respects, I'm a reasonably traditional sort of a fellow, and in other respects, not so traditional. I do, however, enjoy many of the rituals of Christmas and Easter, and our family has many small traditions that help bind us together, and I'm often surprised when something we've done on a regular basis is repeated at the request of our children with the words, "Well, we've traditionally do this at this particular time of the year." And as I've said, these things help us as a family to be a family. We welcome new members to the family, often by invoking small rituals at birthdays and celebrations. We have a number of unwritten rules that ease difficult situations, or by which we can give support to those of our family that need it. And I'm sure you've got family traditions that achieve similar things. And we, of course, here at St. Matt's have our own traditions. Poupée bakes our bread for communion. We continuously develop new liturgies. We do our level best to keep the front pews clear. We offer great music, and we certainly have a certain irreverence about us. I mean, I've even heard St. Thomas's Chapel referred to as the TARDIS. And we use smoke for our major celebrations. You know, the list goes on. There's plenty of them. Of course, not all tradition can be seen in such a benign way. I'm reminded of a story about a relieving minister at a small church. When it came time for the words of institution, he stood behind the altar, spoke the words, raised up the wafer and chalice, and then invited everyone to the table. No one moved. The whole congregation sat still and silent. Eventually, somebody came forward and whispered in his ear. Immediately, the minister went back to the altar, lifted high the wafer, and broke it in two, and then invited everyone to the table again. The congregation gave an audible sigh of relief, and communion proceeded. They couldn't take communion until the bread was broken. That was the tradition. And well, it just wasn't right to come forward without the action. wasn't right, despite all the words, both explicit and implied, given for you, come God's people. None of the congregation heard those words. None could heed the call until the wafer was broken. In this instance, the congregation subdued the ancient intent of the action, replacing it with a new tradition that assumed a sacred status, obscuring the original meaning and ritual. And it's tradition that Mark now writes about in our gospel today. The tradition of the elders as practiced by the Pharisees and some of the scribes. Now bear with me here, for this is a tradition comprised of a very comprehensive and complex holiness code and laws that regulated personal and community life for all Jewish people. By one count alone, there are over 600 mitzvot or commandments in the Torah. 600. I mean, most of us have problem with sort of the 10 guidelines. The purity laws of Leviticus specify in detail clean and unclean foods, the purity rituals after childbirth or menstruation, regulations for skin infections and contaminated clothing or furniture, prohibitions against contact with human corpses, agricultural guidelines about planting seeds and mating animals, and decrees about lawful sexual relationships, keeping the Sabbath, forsaking idols, and there's even a mention about tattoos. These laws encompass nearly every aspect of being human: birth, death, sex, gender, health, economics, jurisprudence, social relations, hygiene, marriage, behaviour, and matters of ethnicity, especially matters of ethnicity. Gentiles were definitely not pure. Some of these purity laws encoded simple common sense or moral ideals that make sense today, such as prohibitions against incest. Others regulated hygiene and sanitation. And still others sought to maintain Israel as a unique identity that differentiated itself from pagan nations. Ultimately, the purity laws and the holiness code ritualized an exhortation from God, and the exhortation being, "Be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy." And when Scripture asks, "Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary?" the proper response is that only people who are ritually clean may approach a holy God. At the center of this purity system, both literally and symbolically, stood the temple, where one performed rites of purification. Now, it's debatable just how much or how little ordinary first-century Jews concerned themselves with maintaining ritual purity, but the Pharisees, whom we've heard so much of in Mark's Gospel, certainly did. We've recently heard how they repeatedly confronted Jesus because of his flagrant disregard for ritual purity. Jesus the Jew touched a leper. His disciples did not fast. He ignored Sabbath laws and touched a woman with a discharge and handled a corpse. And immediately after this week's story, he'll go on to heal 2 Gentiles. Nothing traditional about that. In a gospel reading, Mark recounts a clash between Jesus and the Pharisees, this time about food purity. "Why," asked the Pharisees, "did Jesus' disciples eat with unclean hands?" A direct challenge to Jesus, drawn squarely from the traditions of the day, with the central accusation in this clash being that the Pharisees considered Jesus and his followers as ritually unclean sinners. Here Mark clearly places the Pharisees as the central opponents of Jesus, perhaps because they were central opponents of the church late in the first century when the gospel was written. Remember that with the destruction of the temple in about AD 70, the principal opponents of the Pharisees, the temple-based Sadducees, were destroyed. At the time of Jesus, 2/3 of the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, were Sadducees. Only 1/3 were Pharisees. But after AD 70, the Sanhedrin was entirely composed of Pharisees. And so Mark certainly gives the Pharisees a bad press. Yet it's hard to imagine that all Pharisees were blind to what Jesus had said. We know that the Pharisees saw themselves as a reformist group. They were mainly lay people, not priests, and they believed that the faith of Israel ought to be something lived in the daily life of every Jew, not merely something observed by the priests in Jerusalem. In their eyes, everything belonged to God, and the Torah touched on all matters of life. Keeping Torah was a way of living continually in God's care and acknowledging God's presence everywhere and in everything. Well, it's a bit hard to point a finger at that. Unfortunately, given the human propensity for justifying ourselves and for scapegoating others, the holiness code and purity laws lent themselves to a spiritual stratification or hierarchy between the ritually clean, who consider themselves to be close to God, and the unclean, those who were shunned as impure sinners who were far from God. Instead of expressing the holiness of God, ritual purity became a means of excluding people considered dirty, polluted, or contaminated. Now, Jesus didn't buy into this argument at all. He quotes Isaiah immediately. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition, and in doing so rescind any distinction of ritual purity as a measure of spiritual status. In Marcus Borg's view, Jesus turned the purity system with its sharp social boundaries on its head, and in its place substituted a radically alternate social vision. The new community that Jesus announced would be characterized by inner compassion for all, not external compliance to a purity code, by radically inclusivity rather than hierarchical exclusivity, by inward transformation rather than outward ritual. In place of "be holy, for I am holy," says Borg, Jesus deliberately substituted the call to be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The old tradition is supplanted by a new one. No one is excluded, not Roman collaborators or leopards, not prostitutes, nor the possessed. No one can now be excluded by who or what they are. Well, what went wrong? Well, I guess we need to answer that question by looking at ourselves. Who today might we regard as outcasts? Who might we regard as impure, unclean, dirty, or contaminated? Are the who those who are mentally ill? Are they people who have married 3 or 4 times, extremely wealthy, executives perhaps, beneficiaries, people who hold conservative political views or even views different from our own, or maybe people who sell sex on our streets? What boundaries do we build to keep ourselves, our institutions, and our communities clean? But on the other hand, how do we embrace both holiness and compassion instead of choosing one or the other? Or how do we remove the boundaries we've built to keep ourselves, our institutions, and our communities separate? How could we participate in what Borg calls a community shaped not by the ethos and politics of purity, but by the ethos and politics of compassion? Not an easy task. Perhaps the last words of today's gospel might give us a clue. The spirit of the Pharisees' Judaism intended that the external rituals or traditions would keep the inward heart focused on the central message of the Torah. The goal was to keep a people mindful of their duty to God and neighbour while immersed in the details of everyday life. But Jesus knew that even the best intentions can become corrupted. They can become substitutes for devotion to God while our hearts are occupied with thoughts that promote our own agendas or ignore others. We can honour God with our lips while our hearts are far from God. A clean body by itself is not enough. Cleanliness may be next to godliness, but it makes a poor substitute. What we're told and enjoined to do is to have a pure heart before we can have pure words. Our inner health will determine our status with God, not the traditions and rituals we adopt. Our relationship to God is not determined by what we eat, whether we wash our hands, but by what we do to each other. And so back to the bishop's seat. The three legs: scripture, reason, and tradition. A stool, of course, is made up of more than its legs. It needs a seat to hold everything together. And if one of the characteristics of progressive Christianity is its willingness to question tradition, and by that definition, I guess Jesus is probably the proto-progressive, then I can imagine the seat holding that questioning secure. And if that questioning is applied to the three legs, becomes the norm, the new tradition, then I'm quite comfortable with the analogy, despite how uncomfortable at times that new tradition might be. Amen.